Well, thanks everybody for coming to this week's Students Talk Back, weekly political panel lunch discussion. My name is Schnur, and I'm the director of the Unruh Institute of Politics here at SC. And we co-sponsor these lunches every week, co-sponsored between the Unruh Institute and the Schwarzenegger Institute of Global and Public Policy over in the Price School. And every week, as I think many of you know, we bring together a panel of both off-campus policy and political experts and on-campus policy and political experts as well for a discussion on a different topic. I'm joined each week by one of the editors of the Daily Trojan, and I'm really happy to have back one of our longtime co-moderators, the DT's former editor-in-chief and currently special projects editor?
Yeah.
Is this a special project?
Anything's a special project.
Okay, good. The DT's special projects editor, Unruh Rothberg. And together, we'll work with our panel to provide an overview of today's conversation. To frack or not to frack, that's the question. And talking about very serious issues of energy exploration here in California and elsewhere. And we've really got an excellent panel here today. I'll introduce them in just 1 second, but just to let those of you know who haven't joined us in the past, our usual format is for Daniel and I to spend roughly the first half of each week's discussion asking questions of the panelists, and then at roughly the halfway point at about 12:30, we'll open up the questions to all of you so you have a chance to ask any or all of our panelists questions that either they haven't had a chance to get to yet or things that you think may be important that should be part of the discussion as well. So let me introduce our panelists. Sitting right next to me here is Brenna Norton, and Brenna is currently the Southern California organizer for Food and Water Watch. She's the former grassroots organizer for the National Sustainable Agricultural Coalition on federal food and farm policy. Brenna, thanks very much for coming.
Thank you.
You can clap for her, guys. And I'm going to skip over the very nattily dressed young man in the suit for just a minute and come back to him. But moving one more over is Dave Quast. And Dave is currently the California director of the Energy in Depth program. He's also an adjunct professor at USC School for Communications. And so at the end of today's program, if you are sufficiently impressed by what you hear from Dave, when is your class offered, Dave?
6 o'clock tonight.
6 o'clock tonight. Okay, a little bit late for tonight's class, but for spring semester, he's still letting people in. Dave has worked for almost 20 years in the area of strategic communications for corporate, legal, and nonprofit clients. Dave, thanks very much for coming. We appreciate you having here. And last and certainly not least, our two student panelists, Jake Jordan, the aforementioned nattily dressed young man, sitting in between Brenna and Dave. Jake is a student at USC Dornsife School of International Relations. And at the far end of the table today is Kelsey Harrison, as a student in USC Dornsife's Department of Political Science. Kelsey and Jake, we're really glad that you guys are here.
So just sort of to start out the discussion, as is the case with really any policy debate and discussion, both sides sort of define the discussion differently. So I was wondering if our guests, Brenna Norton and Dave Quast, could sort of give us a brief overview on how they define fracking, starting with Brenna.
Testing. All right, howdy everybody. My name's Brenna, again with Food and Water Watch. We're a watchdog nonprofit funded by our members and takes zero corporate or government money, so of the people, by the people. So what is fracking? Well, I know what the oil and gas industry tells you what fracking is. Hydraulic fracturing is, of course, the injection of millions of gallons of water, sand, and known toxic chemicals under very high pressures, very deep underground, to break apart rock or other formations and release the trapped oil or gas. Now, in the bigger picture, fracking, as I'm sure you all know from just hearing the word, has become to mean something a little bit more than just the practice, which is the entire practice of what it takes to actually do that. The trucking in of the millions of gallons of water, the trucking in of the thousands of gallons of chemicals that they have to inject in each well, all the sand that they have to move to inject in that well. It's the whole process. It's also, the wastewater that they're bringing up when they, after they frack, and we're talking about millions of gallons of toxic sludge, and water that has no carcinogenic chemicals, and also the radioactive material that they're bringing up from deep in the earth. So it's the entire process of it, and I think it's common sense that when we look at a practice, we don't just look at, oh, hydraulic fracturing is just this, but the entire thing that it takes to make that happen, right? So getting all the materials there and getting all the materials out. And there's also a lot of things in the movement when you hear this term fracking that are related to it, including acidizing, which is the process of injecting hydrochloric and hydrofluoric acid. This stuff would burn your skin and disintegrate it upon touching it. Because injecting thousands of gallons of hydrochloric and fluoric acid into the earth, sometimes near schools and homes, sounds like a great idea. And I'll just close up, but I just want to say that we as a movement really see acidizing in these different technologies as far as under the name fracking as well, even though they are slightly different, but it's really high pressure and it's really dangerous.
Okay. So Brenna, we should gather, thinks that hydraulic fracturing is not a particularly good idea. Dave, although the process itself is relatively straightforward, as Brenna talked about, the impacts and byproducts of that process are in dispute. So as Daniel asked, maybe you can take a moment to offer a definition of the process, and then maybe also talk a little bit about the impacts as Brenna framed them.
Sure, thanks. And is this working? Do I even need it? Good to be here, thank you. I think Brenna was pretty much right in her initial description of what hydraulic fracturing actually is, which is the injection of fluid at depth in order to release oil, in this case in California, mostly oil, and in some places natural gas resources. She's right that it takes place very deep. I'm glad she mentioned that. Mostly it takes place at depths where if you were drilling from here and you were at the Staples Center, you'd be maybe halfway there. Very deep. And it takes place in a heavily regulated environment at the state level by the Division of Oil and Gas and Natural Resources. Now, one of the things that a lot of people don't understand about hydraulic fracturing, because they think it's this new thing, fracking is a new thing. Fracking is a word made up by a documentary filmmaker from New York. It sounds a lot like, and that's why people use it. And in fact, even a poll that Dan recently did asked the question using the word frack versus the word hydraulic fracturing, and people really didn't like fracking, but they were a little better with hydraulic fracturing. This has actually been going on since I think it's safe to say anyone in this room was born. It started during the Truman administration. A guy named George Mitchell out of Texas invented the technology. It's been steadily improving ever since. He recently passed away, and I actually did some work with that foundation on conservation issues and ways, to ensure that the technology, is as safe as possible. But the point is, it's been going on for about 60 years. It's safety as a fundamentally, there's always problems with any industrial process, but when you say something is fundamentally safe, it's like saying flying is fundamentally safe, driving is fundamentally safe. It needs to be regulated, but everyone from President Obama to federal regulators to the new Secretary of Energy just last week, to Governor Brown, certainly no right-wing friend of the energy industry, to the Division of Oil and Gas, who are the scientists who work for Governor Brown, and the scientists who work in and out of the academy and for the industry have all confirmed that it's a fundamentally safe process. The reason you're only hearing about it now is because of kind of the word fracking and because of these films. This actually, it would sort of be like me being unaware of whatever the fifth step in open heart surgery is. It's not a scandal that I don't know it, it's just not really relevant to my life. Now everyone's concerned about hydraulic fracturing, so we have new regulations and we're trying to get the word out and explain to people what it is so the process doesn't seem as scary, because it's literally been happening your entire life.
Thank you, Dave. As I think you guys have gathered, our two off-campus guests bring ever so slightly different perspectives to this discussion. And what I'll suggest now, because I know a lot of you who are attending today have very strong feelings on one side of the issue or the other, I think our two guests set an excellent example, as we try to do every week, of having these conversations not as debates, but as discussions where people from different viewpoints can weigh in with mutual respect for the other person's opinion, even if they don't necessarily agree with it. So great example, and we'll ask you guys to follow it once we open up the discussion in just a little bit. With that said, I want to bring Kelsey Harrison into this discussion because, Kelsey, you've researched in particular, you've researched public opinion, and more specifically, the depth of public knowledge as to this issue. And for our audience members who don't normally, who attend these panels regularly, they'll know we don't normally start with definitions. But we thought it was a good idea just to make sure that everyone here understood the terms in use, tell us a little bit about your research and what you found in terms of public awareness on this issue, would you?
Thank you so much. So I did a lot of research in the public perception of natural gas and hydraulic fracturing. And obviously, as we can see, the public is very split on their opinions. And as the California Public Policy Institute found in July, about 51% completely oppose any increased drilling to extract oil and natural gas, 35% favor it, and 14% don't know. And of the 35% that favor it, 62% favor stricter regulation. So I think there's kind of an unknown factor in hydraulic fracturing because it's come on the scene so quickly.
You mean fracking though, right? You don't mean 51% of people oppose drilling, do you? Or do you?
I mean, yeah, the
Okay.
drilling method of.
What's not a drilling method? Oh, we'll talk about that later. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, so Kelsey, what I understand you saying is 51% of people oppose the method of hydraulic fracturing, is
Yeah,
that right?
in the poll that the
Okay,
Public
good.
Policy
Go ahead.
Institute found. So I think there is a large movement by the government to create more regulation that has been supported by the people. And a poll by USC done said that 41% support keeping fracking legal with more regulation, and 14% support it even if there's no more regulation. So that's 2/3 of public agree that we should move forward with it as long as there is some regulation.
And I would fact check some of those too, because I know there's been 2 polls recently that show the majority of Californians are opposed to fracking. So I think we need to look at who did those polls and a little bit more in depth with
USC
that
did.
too. Yeah, okay, but who they're funded by as well.
Okay. And I'll just add a point here, and Brenna, just for clarification, there have been 2 polls over the last several months released by different entities at USC on this question. Brenna is correct in referencing one that did receive some of its funding from the energy industry, and there's been a certain amount of controversy over that as to whether that affected the way the poll was conducted. What I'll say, just for the sake of clarity, not to take sides in this, is the poll that Kelsey was referring to is the USC Dornsife LA Times poll, which does not take any outside money from sources. And reasonable people can disagree. For those of you who follow public opinion polling, you know that the way you ask a question can have a dramatic impact on the outcome. Reasonable people can disagree on how questions were framed. But just for point of clarification, 2 different polls. One that you're absolutely correct did receive funding from a source with a vested interest in the outcome. The one that we run is funded only through internal sources.
One thing, could I say one thing really quick? What I thought was interesting about that poll, because I actually used it in my class, mostly complimentarily, although there were a few issues I had with the way the questions were worded. What I thought was interesting is not only did 2/3 of people support regulated hydraulic fracturing, there were 19% of people who said they didn't want any more regulation at all. That's not even the industry's point of view. And the question said, hydraulic fracturing is unregulated in the state. Do you support regulation? And 19% of people said no. I would have said yes. I mean, you don't want to have something that's this potentially problematic, unregulated. I mean, it could be incredible. Anything could be problematic if not regulated. So I thought, even though the question was pretty, I thought, incorrect, you still had 2/3 of people who said that they supported regulation.
We want to bring Jake into this conversation, but just to offer a little bit of perspective on all these poll numbers, as I said earlier, the way you ask a poll question to a large degree is very determinant on the outcome. So that question, and I don't have it in front of me, essentially said, as you've heard these guys reference, one option was, should there be, and I'm paraphrasing, a certain level of regulation? And as Kelsey correctly pointed out, lots of people thought that there should be some regulation of fracking. How much is enough? How much is too much? How much is too little? That's where the conversation gets more complicated, and that's a conversation that will continue going forward. So technically speaking, both Brenna and Dave are right, depending on how you define a certain amount of regulation or some regulation. Daniel?
And speaking of regulation, we're going to turn to Jake for a minute, who's done a lot of research on SB4, a bill that was recently approved by the California legislature, and a few amendments were added that created some controversy. and caused some environmental groups to withdraw their support for the legislation. I was wondering if you could give us sort of an update and maybe talk a little bit about the policy of fracking regulation in California.
Yeah, sure. So SB4, the bill in question, recently passed the House or the State Assembly and went to Jerry Bryan to sign it. And he added a few amendments that actually make the bill, in some people's opinions, moot or null and void. The key amendment to the new bill is the fact that the environmental regulatory process, which is typically necessary to be approved prior to a fracking well being reapproved, is now not necessarily, it can be exempt from the current process. So this could mean that the environmental review process, which could take X or Y amount of days, could be completed after the entire review process of the fracking bill. So a well in question could be approved, and then the entire environmental review process could occur after the approval of this well, which basically is a hit for the regulation of it. The good parts about the bill is that an environmental review will still be conducted to see the merits of fracking, what the potential dangers are. But the big deal recently was the fact that he added these amendments, and many people in the environmental community thought that these would basically make the bill null and void.
What about people sort of in the environmental community? How was the bill received by sort of both sides?
So from my research, I saw that most of the environmental community actually did not want this bill to be passed because they are more in favor, instead of just regulation, which is what this bill intends to do, they are in favor of banning fracking. They're in favor of banning the hydraulic fracturing process due to the fact that there's wastewater, there's air contaminants, there's a lot of environmental issues that arise due to fracking that have not been fully explored and are at risk in certain cases where you have waste well pits that aren't fully built or aren't built correctly. And without the presence of regulation, there's no way to mediate what a new well could do to the surrounding area or what could happen to the people who own the land that is on top of those wells. So the environmentalists, at least from my research, a lot of them were against this bill because they're more for the ban of fracking rather than just the minimal regulation of fracking.
And Brenna, maybe you can take a minute or two and take Jake's observations and take them a couple steps further, offer your own thoughts on how this discussion has progressed or regressed, in your opinion, as the bills move through the legislative process to the governor.
Great. Okay. I think he kind of covered the regulatory bill, and I think I want to talk more about this practice to begin with and why the majority of public health and environmental groups, there's no debate left. Again, we have to be clear to the two people on this panel. I work for a nonprofit, and Energy in Depth represents the oil and gas industry in California, just to be totally transparent here. But there's really no debate left here. Even when we get to, I'm going to talk through a couple of things. Obviously, I could talk for an hour and a half about from water and air contamination problems to earthquakes to the economic value problems this practice brings to communities. But I don't have that time, nor do you, so I'm going to try to be very concise here. Even the industry's own papers, many got leaked and many were published from many energy companies, show that they have a problem that can't be fixed. Let's be clear here. When they're doing the practice of fracking, they have to line a well with several inches of cement. Have any of you walked on a sidewalk recently? Is cement perfect? Is there cracks in that concrete? I mean, this is pretty common sense, right? We're injecting water at the level that could slice through steel with 600 known toxic and carcinogenic chemicals into the soul of our earth. And we're saying that several inches of cement are going to protect our water supply. Let's look at common sense here, right? So the industry's own documents that were leaked, one entire report is about how these cement wells fail. 6% wells fail immediately upon fracking, and 40 to 50% fail over 30 years. Let me repeat that. The only thing that's protecting our water supply, the majority of it is going to fail, that cement. And this is the industry's own documents. There's thousands of documented cases of water contamination across the country. Even just in July, I just was reading this morning that the National Academy of Sciences in July published a report saying that in Pennsylvania, the closer you live to a well used to hydraulically fracture, the more likely it is that your water is to be contaminated. Many of you have probably followed the politics of the EPA investigations, where numerous EPA investigations have been closed down right before elections, right at an opportune time when the results are showing that fracking has caused water contamination, and those investigations have been closed down. And a whistleblower from the EPA and the LA Times recently published that they had results showing that Pennsylvania water contamination was due to fracking, and that investigation was closed down. I'm just giving you kind of an overview there. I don't have much more time, but I'll get more into the severe air and economic problems.
And actually, Brenna, we'll make sure that you have a chance as we go into questions from the students to talk to this further.
Great.
But we do want to keep the conversation somewhat even-handed, and so
I'm sure there's a lot that Dave would like to respond to, but is it true that this is a problem that can't be fixed?
No, well, of course not. I mean, if you've noticed all the methane that's in your water lately, then maybe you have a problem, but this, again, has been happening your entire life. Now, listen, it's not me saying this. And by the way, the Park Foundation pays your salary, not whatever. I mean, you know, there are interest groups on both sides, and there are people who have a vested interest in things turning out a certain way on both sides. So don't pretend like you're funded by $25 donations. Now,
We are.
everybody. No, you're.
Hey, guys.
You're really not. Okay.
let's, since we're relatively short on
let me
time,
address
let's
something really quick.
stick to
It's important.
the
Okay.
topic.
Let's do that. So the Secretary of Energy, the Secretary of the Interior, the past Secretary of Energy, the past Secretary of the Interior, all Democratic appointments. The head of the Division of Oil and Gas in California. State regulators from around the country in all of the states where oil and gas development take place have all said there's never been a single case of water contamination that's been directly linked to hydraulic fracturing. Now that sounds like hyperbole. I almost kind of in some ways wish I could say, well, there were 2, but they were contained, because that sounds more realistic. But when asked the direct question as early as 2 weeks ago, these regulators, the top regulators in the country, scientists, PhDs, people smarter than documentary filmmakers, have said there's never been a case of water contamination. Now, if you take the broad definition of hydraulic fracturing as everything that happens in the life of a well, sure, you are going to have well casing failures and so on. But this is something that has to be made clear. People talk about fracking wells. There's no such thing. Fracking is a well completion technique. It's done after drilling. It's not a drilling technique. So once you drill a well, for however long that takes, a week or 2 or a month, you take the drilling equipment away, you bring in the fracturing trucks, and you fracture the well. That takes 1 or 2 days. Then you take the water and you go away. And then the well produces for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, potentially. But what's in the well bore is not fracturing fluid. What's in the well bore is almost 95% water, and the rest of it is either oil or gas. So hydraulic fracturing takes in California about 24 hours. So just so you understand relatively what we're talking about here. And to say something is inherently unsafe, that would be like saying because there are plane crashes, flying is inherently unsafe, so instead of regulating it and having the FAA, we're going to ban flying. It's a direct analogy. So he's right. He's right that the extreme environmental groups, I mean the non-constructive ones, oppose this from the beginning, the bill, because they say, quite frankly, there's no regulation of hydraulic fracturing that can happen. And then they presume to describe what kind of regulations we need, which is a lot like a fox giving him directions on how to build a hen house. They don't want hydraulic fracturing. They don't want any of it. It doesn't matter what was in the bill. They were going to oppose it, and they said so, and they're on the record saying so.
We're gonna give Brenna in just a second a chance to weigh in as well, but our student panelists have other points that they want to make as well, and so we're gonna go first to Jake and then to Kelsey. Jake, in addition to the very strong differences of opinion we've just seen within California, there's differences on this issue that break down across the nation, not just on a partisan basis, Democrat versus Republican, but to a large degree regionally as well. And you've done some research that's found that Californians approach this issue differently than people in other states do. Is that right?
Yeah, so a quick background on what is going on in California. There's the Monterey Shale Shelf, which is potentially one of the largest shale oil and new oil reserves for California. The problem is that the geographic formation of it is very unconventional, and so that hydraulic fracturing is the best optimal method for acquiring this natural gas and oil. It has the potential to really boost California's economy, like really bring it back up to par. But there are two different interests that actually have long coexisted but are now kind of in conflict, agriculture and oil. As many of you know, if you've ever driven up I-5, you'll see a lot of the signs that say Congress created water crisis or farmers in water crisis, that type of thing. One of the big deals is that for the process of hydraulic fracturing, you have to actually tank in millions and millions of gallons of water. Now, comparatively, agriculture obviously takes up a lot more water than this does comparatively, but the problem that exists in a situation where you have an inland that is striving for water and is heavily based economically on agriculture versus an oil interest that wants to go into this land because they're situated on top of the shelf and dig down way, like thousands of feet down, way past the point where land is being affected topically, unless there, of course, is a leak, but as he said, there's been no documented leakage of those waters. So what you have is a conflict of interest where you have farmers who think that all this water is coming out of their potential to get the freshwater reserves, and so they're opposing it based on that logic. They think, oh, we can't get the water we need, how are they getting this type of water? But the fact of the matter is that is comparatively not true. Agriculture has a vastly, vastly larger withdrawal of freshwater supplies than the process of hydraulic fracturing does. Does that answer your question?
Can I put that in perspective a little bit?
Yeah.
Because you're right. A good way to look at it is well, there's two good ways to look at it, just so you understand what, first of all, it's not millions of gallons. In California, it actually takes 116,000 gallons of water on average to fracture a well in California. Back east, it is millions of gallons. It's just because of the different geology that we have. Yeah, but it's a huge difference. Not that there's anything wrong with it either place. But the Groundwater Protection Council has said that oil and gas operations use less than 1% of the water supplies in the areas around the country where oil and gas development takes place. Now, that's including the millions of gallons they use back east. In California, it's a small percentage of a small percentage of a percent. To put it in perspective, that's 116,000 for one well. There were about 700, we don't frack that many wells in California, it's about a quarter. So there were about 768, I think, something in the 700s wells fracked last year. So if you added up all the water that was used, it used the same amount of water that California's golf courses used in 8 hours. For the whole year. So that's just a little perspective. 202 acre feet of water, 202, not 1,000, 202 versus 34 million acre feet for agriculture. So there's no conflict there.
Let's just turn to economics of fracking again for 1 second. Ms. Kelsey's done a lot of research on sort of how the public perceives fracking as it concerns to the cost of fracking. So I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about polling on that.
Yeah, in the same USC LA Times poll that I was mentioning before, the level of support for hydraulic fracturing increased statewide from 45% to 56%. If it could be shown that fracking would reduce energy and gasoline prices. So obviously right now in our current economic environment, energy prices are rising, and this increase of a different, energy source would really lower prices, and I think the public is behind that as well. And in terms of the increased number of jobs that this would bring to the area of the Monterey Shelf, there's definitely an area bias in California as to where people live and how their thoughts are. And people actually in a poll done by the Public Policy Institute of California showed that I think 2/3 of the people in the Central Valley are for increased drilling in the area because of the job creation.
Thanks, Kelsey. And we want to bring you guys into the conversation in just a minute, but just as we gave Dave a chance to talk a little bit about his reaction to Jake's research, we want to make sure to give Brenna a chance to weigh in here also, because Brenna, what the polling shows, not surprisingly, is if you tell people this will make your gasoline cost less, that causes support for the process to go up. On the other hand, as I think a lot of you know, a lot of cities around the state have instituted bans on plastic bags. And the argument against that in most municipalities is, but that's going to cost the consumer more also. Talk a little bit about the environmental protection versus consumer cost discussion and how you guys approach that conversation.
Great, happy to. Two things just to lay out to go back to one thing that was mentioned several times that's blatantly wrong. The fracking that we're talking about today is not your grandmother's drilling. This didn't exist, the type of fracking we're talking about today 10 to 15 years ago. It's a rapidly advanced technology. They couldn't drill as deep and long. They didn't have the chemicals. They didn't use 10 to 100 times the amount of water and bring up the toxic sludge. entirely different technology and completely false of the oil and gas industry to use their favorite talking point that this has been done for 60 years, and so you're just fine. Not true, not the same.
Go to both of our websites maybe or something, because that's absolutely untrue.
Yeah, and
Absolutely
go to our
untrue.
websites too.
I said both of them.
And going back to the economic issue here, what's really interesting here, to make clear, fracking here in California or Los Angeles would not affect the price of the pump for you at all. Let me repeat that again. It would not affect the price of the pump for you at all. Oil is set on a global market. So fracking here is not going to affect the price of the pump, and that's also a favorite line of the oil and gas industry to get you to buy into this destructive technology. Oil exports have become a big business in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we're really talking about fracking for China right now. Obviously, when you're a business, you export to who will pay the highest. Right now, Asia and China, $20 for natural gas. Here in the US, $2. So who do you think we're trying to export to the most? We're exporting a lot of this through LNG pipelines rather. So big picture, also there's a great report on our website that I'm happy to give you called US Energy Insecurity, Why Fracking for Oil and Gas is a False Solution. And I'm happy to provide this to all of you guys today. And we also have PhD research scientists on our staff. And the popular claim that this is 100 years of natural gas really says that no places will be off limits to oil and fracking. And really with our plans to export a lot of this and also use it for now transportation and for electricity, we're really looking at more like 20 to 50 years when you actually do the real math of how much consumption we use now and how much we would if we continue to create more infrastructure to use natural gas. And that's really simple mathematical calculations that
And
can
so,
be done.
and so going back to the polling questions that Kelsey referenced, the question was, if this process were to make your gasoline and energy prices go down, would you be more likely to support it? And the answer to that, as you pointed out, was yes. Brenna's argument, as you heard, well, it would not. And so therefore, presumably, support for the process would not increase. I'm guessing that Dave disagrees with that assertion, and we'll give him a chance to weigh in on it in just a second. But we promised you that we want to make sure to give you guys a chance to weigh in as well. So we're going to broaden the conversation at this point. And for those of you who haven't been here before, just two things we'd ask of you. Number one, we'd ask when we call on you, tell us who you are, tell us your name, so we know who's entering the conversation. And second, particularly on a conversation on an issue as highly charged as this one, particularly if you're going to be asking a question of someone on the panel with whom you disagree, we'd ask that you show the same respect and regard for them that you hope they would show for you when asking a question of you. So with those two requests, let's broaden the discussion. Yes, let's start with you.
Okay. So my name is Cameron. I'm currently a third-year chemical engineer. So I just have like 4 questions to everyone.
I'll tell you what.
Just 4 questions.
Let's do one, and then maybe we can come back to others once other people have a chance to weigh in.
The most important question is, the interesting about the shale gas is like the technology moving so fast. And I work for a shale gas company during the summer, and the thing is we don't use water anymore for the fracking. Well, some states they still use water, but for the state they don't have enough water, we use liquid nitrogen. And for that case, you don't have to put a lot of chemicals in, because the reason you put chemicals in it, you have to reduce the friction.
Cameron, your question for the panel?
Oh, Brenna.
But what is the question?
Oh, so what's your opinion about that? I mean, if we don't have to use water, do you think it's still a good thing, or like what?
Brenna, does your opinion change if the process is accomplished without the use of water?
Well, I'd have to see what you're looking at. I know that the industry is planning to use acidizing a lot, right? They say we're not using water, and I'm like, great, you're using hydrochloric and fluoric acid instead, which is also incredibly dangerous. So I'd have to look into more, but generally, right, like climate change is a huge issue, and we need to keep this oil in the ground to stop adverse severe climate impacts. So big picture here, we're talking about this is oil in California we're fracking for. There's no facade of this being good for the environment like natural gas too. So I think that kind of answers the question there.
So just to be clear, regardless of how the process is done, if the end product is more oil, given the climate change and global warming impact, that's something for significant concern.
Indeed, but I think no matter how you sway this process, if you're using slightly less water, slightly less chemicals, it's a very dangerous technology.
Yes?
Could I just respond to one thing?
Yeah, of course.
Some of this is just high school chemistry. I put hydrochloric acid in a swimming pool the other day and then let my daughter swim in it. You do that to prevent algae from growing. You know, there are such things as concentrations. I mean, the EPA sets levels of safety for different chemicals where everything is a chemical. To say something is dangerous is just putting a word in front of it. I mean, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. We have to keep this stuff in perspective and not just get people agitated because you can say acid and that's automatically a bad thing. That's half the pH table. Now, the other thing I wanted to say, just in response to this idea that hydraulic fracturing is new or somehow different and scary, this is the same hydraulic fracturing we've been doing. There is horizontal drilling, which is something they do back east where you have long strata of shale and you can go down and you can drill for a few miles horizontally, which is great because then there's only one wellhead and so, you know, it's a lot less impact on the environment. However, we don't really do that here because we have a lot of geologic faulting and the Monterey Shale is very complex. The reason we haven't developed it is not because it's illegal. The reason we haven't developed it is because we don't have the technology yet to develop it. Are there companies that might use hydraulic fracturing on some wells? Yeah. But hydraulic fracturing is something, it's a completion technique, like I said. You decide what completion technique you're going to use based on the geology of the well. Like I said, we only do about 25% of the wells.
You know what, at the conclusion of the panel today, we're going to make sure that both Brenna and Dave have a chance to give you the websites for their respective organizations, so you can go from even more detailed information than we can fit in 1 hour.
But the bottom line is most of our fracking is vertical. It's not horizontal, and it's not new. It's been around.
And we're going to continue to give them a chance to respond to each other on the off chance that they don't agree on everything from this point forward. But we do want to make sure to get some of your more of your questions in as well. So yes.
Hi, my name is Julian Jesse M, a climate science professor in the Department of Earth Sciences. So I'm glad you brought in climate because that's, you know, one of the main talking points nationally of the gas industry to bring this into the phrase to say, well, gas per unit of energy, gas emits about half as much CO2 as burning the same amount of coal or generating the same amount of energy. So, you know, gas is better for the environment in that respect. But there is a fallacy is that it's only CO2 emissions that count and not methane leak. And methane, of course, is a very potent greenhouse gas. Now, there is some disagreement between, not surprisingly, environmental organizations and industry-funded think tanks.
Julian, I'm sorry, the question for the panelists?
The question is, what, you know, both to Dave and Brenna, how would they estimate the amount of methane leakage, or what, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, what would be the pros and cons of fracking in that, you know, looking at the whole picture, not just CO2, but adding the methane leaks as well?
Right. Well, there's numerous studies and scientific PhD research from the National Oceanic Atmosphere Association, from the University of Colorado. The only peer-reviewed study in the entire United States about fracking and air emissions, which shows that there's serious problems with toxic chemicals being released and air problems, and that people are having can have severe health problems and being exposed to this. But getting to climate change, yes, the scientific consensus is getting more and more, as I'm sure you've seen, from people like Tony Agrafia at Cornell University, professor of engineering, and many, many other scientists, that methane is actually worse in the short term over coal, because methane is 100 times more potent of a greenhouse gas than CO2. Not that we want coal, but that really this is a false choice. And really what we need to do is be getting off all fossil fuels and push the renewables that we have to. And like I was saying before, we're talking about 20 to 50 years of natural gas and 5 to 7 years of oil. And then what? Then we're going to have to force to go to these renewables. We need to do that now.
Dave?
Okay. I mean, if this is a conversation about we all have to stop using fossil fuels, then that's fine. But this is a very specific question about methane leakage. And of course, that's a concern. I mean, methane is the primary constituent of natural gas. So it's, you know, the industry this is the only time the other side doesn't think we have a profit motive. You know, you want to capture that methane and you want to use that methane for heating homes and for powering vehicles and things like that. A study just came out yesterday, which I saw it's already being land-based. It is industry funded. It came out from the University of Texas and the Environmental Defense Fund, which showed that estimates of methane leakage are significantly lower even than the EPA previously had estimated, about 1.5% or so. So that's always an issue. It's always something the industry's trying to do better, because you're right. I mean, that does pose climate issues if methane is rampant. So yeah, but the good news is the numbers seem to bear out that it's significantly cleaner. And in fact, this was just the Energy Secretary the other day. Fracking is climate friendly, environmentally safe, and economically stimulating. The reason that we lead the world in climate and CO2 emission reductions, which is an amazing thing when you think about the United States with all of our fossil fuel use, that we could lead the world. We do, yeah, according to the EIA. We lead the world. We now have our CO2 emissions down to 1990 levels, which was the goal of our global warming law, AB 32. That's the Energy Information Administration. So that, I don't make this stuff up. I'm not allowed to. I'm held to a high standard. So you have to, that's a good thing, but the reason is because we're using natural gas in our power plants instead of coal. And the only way you get natural gas, especially in the East, is hydraulic fracturing.
I'm sorry, we'd like our audience members to ask a question as opposed to several.
But you're right.
So let's go on to anyone else who might have questions. Anyone else? Yes?
So if it's a question of regulating and banning fracking in the industry, how would regulation exactly happen in a way that we can make sure that, because there's a lot of sites that are really far from population centers, and I'm not sure how you would regulate that the tailing ponds where the waste goes are not being evaporated into the air, or where VOCs are not being emitted into the air by the fracking site. So how exactly would those things be controlled?
Well, you raise a good point that they're far away from population centers. In fact, 90% of the fracking that happens in California happens in Kern County, and it happens far away from cities, and it happens where there's not even actually any groundwater resource. So, the idea that this is going on under our feet is a falsehood. The answer is you regulate. I mean, you have people there at the well site. You have people from Dogger. You have people from, in other aspects of oil and gas, you have people from the federal government. And of course, you have mandatory reporting, and you have transparency, hopefully, through the regulatory process. That's been one of the things that I think SB4 was trying to do, and certainly that Dogger in its division of oil and gas and its regulations is trying to do primarily is kind of shine more of a spotlight on this process, because obviously people are concerned, people are scared. If I was told the things that are regularly in press releases I read and I didn't know about it, I'd be scared too. I have kids that drink water and breathe air. We're all Californians who want the same thing, I think, in that regard. So it's really important that regulations are such that they make people unafraid. Show people exactly what's in the fluid. Make that mandatory. Have notice before hydraulic fracturing is done. Have testing after it's done. All of these things the public can go and avail themselves of, so that they can get a comfort level that obviously, I think the more you know about it, the more you don't have to worry about it. Again, it's not a new process, but I think the regulations are going in the right direction in that regard, at least, to make it more transparent.
Brenna?
Yeah, on that, one thing I think is important to note, the oil and gas industry spent $2 million in the first quarter of 2013 alone in lobbying in Sacramento. I certainly don't have that kind of money. I'm a citizen lobbyist. They also are exempted from every single environmental Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, and they claimed a special exemption in the 2005 Energy Act, that they're exempt from all these famous and well-established environmental laws. So if it's so safe, if this practice is so safe, why are they spending billions lobbying? Why are they spending billions getting exempted from every environmental regulation on the books? They're so special that they get that exemption from. I asked that question. And two, and a minute, I'm not done yet.
Just say Halliburton, it gets everybody excited.
On to that, it's a great question, right? How can we regulate this practice? And that's why we're calling for a ban, because there is no way to safely regulate this practice. And I think when you look at when you learn more about it and see all these cases and the documented science and the documented cases of water contaminant crisis across this country, you will see there's not. Dogger, the state regulatory agency, little bit of political knowledge, through an interesting maneuver, their salaries are actually paid by the oil and gas industry in California. The same industry that's supposed to regulate, their salaries are paid by the oil and gas industry. And I know the oil and gas industry will say, oh, that's a common practice. Don't you think that raises a little bit of a problem, that the people that are supposed to be safeguarding our water and our health, our salaries are paid by the industry they're supposed to be regulating?
We've got time for just another question or two, but before I go back to the audience, I want to just make sure with Jake and Kelsey, if there's anything else either of you found in the research that you did for your respective classes that you think might be beneficial for the audience. We got some good insight in terms of public opinion research that Kelsey found, and Jake's examination as well. Anything else that either of you want to raise
I'll say something. This issue is not going anywhere. This is going to come up again and again and again, and unless we can find an equitable solution for it, which I am fairly confident as a citizen that there is not going to be a ban on fracking anytime soon. The economic potential is way too high, and the interests that are involved will never let this die. There's just too much potential here. So what has to happen is there has to be an equitable discussion on how we can regulate this process.
And I just follow one.
Spoken as somebody who's been sitting in between the two.
And I need to.
Very well put it.
I do need to say one thing that hasn't been mentioned here. There's hundreds of states across this country, including about, I think, 130 in New York City who've banned fracking, 3 in Colorado this last year and a half. The state of New York has a moratorium, and numerous countries have banned the practice. So is it possible? Yes, and it's actually already happening. Is it going to be hard in California? Oh yeah, because we're an oil and gas state, so we're going up against some powerful interest, and we're going to need everybody involved to do that.
Okay, I'm going to ask this young man to weigh in, and then we'll get back to our panel.
I'm Jason Miller. I'm a senior. I'm a psychology major, but before I was in psychology, I transferred from a different college where I was majoring in geology, so I have about 7 or 8 geology classes under my belt. Not a recent article, I should say, I've heard of a case study where there was hydraulic fracturing going on over in Pennsylvania. It was in a remote area, and somehow the ground penetrating radar missed a perched aquifer, and it was connected to a local woman's well, and they fracked, and what happened was that there's now basically natural gas seeping through the pipes. My question is, what technology is the fracking industry doing to prevent I guess basically what would be considered pore pressure building up and thus causing a huge frack in the shale, if you will, and prevent the chemicals from, if we're using gas here, for example, to rise up through the intercranial pores of the shale to go into perched aquifers that are not necessarily within or around the site.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of what the states, I'm not familiar with that particular case, but I mean, that's way regulation exists, right? I mean, that's why we have it.
It's not a regulation question.
Okay. Again, Jason.
Well, it is. I don't know the technology of it. You probably know better than I do. But there's one thing I want to correct, because this is kind of one of the big lies about hydraulic fracturing. Like Josh Fox now will at least admit that fracking has never contaminated water. He'll say, yeah, but it's this other stuff. The other one is this idea that there are exemptions from laws. Okay, I don't think there is a more, for good reason obviously, there's a more regulated industry than the oil and gas industry. It's covered by a tapestry of laws, from the federal, Clean Safe Drinking Water Act, all of those federal laws, to DOGGR, its regulations, and CEQA. I mean, California has the most progressive environmental laws in the country, and that's something we should be proud of. But the one thing that's not true is that hydraulic fracturing is covered by federal law, and there's a very good reason for that. There was no exemption for it. It was never ever covered. They say Halliburton loophole because Dick Cheney's a bad guy, something I probably agree with, but anyway. And they say that, and it makes everyone get all scared because he used to be the CEO of Halliburton. Doesn't really matter. In 2005, what happened was there was some agitation for federal regulation of hydraulic fracturing. That was obviously something the industry didn't think was appropriate because of things like state geology, where it's all so different, and you have to have different rules for different places. I mean, what works in California is not the same as what works in North Dakota, believe me, it's a completely different process. So there was a sense of, I don't know if the Senate or the House or whatever, to clarify that hydraulic fracturing wasn't covered by the Safe Drinking Water Act or the Clean Water Act, but they never had been before. Same is true with CEQA. So there's no exemptions, there's just a reaffirmation of the status quo. So I just want to make that point. I think it's important.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then Brenna, we'll only have a minute or two left, but you're certainly entitled to weigh in as well.
Oh, well, I just guess, on that point, I'm happy to get every single email here and send you the 2005 Energy Exemption Act from all these laws. So, again, I can't make up stuff either. Everything's backed up by science and facts. I don't know that I'd rather have students have questions and people.
Okay, so the young man in the back had his hand up before you did, so yes, sir.
My name is Dennis, and everyone's talking about the benefits, this boom, it's going to be you can't fight it, it's the way of the future, it's a bridge fuel, it's this fuel. No one talks about the externalities associated with this stuff. I don't know if you have any economists in here, but what is the cost of a poisoned aquifer? What is the cost of having to deal with medical bills? I'm in contact with some people in Mayflower right now. They're dealing with the tar sands. So is so busy talking about how much money it can give us, no one ever asks the question, how much damage could it cause? And that is a very short-sighted thing. So I'd like anyone in the panel to address that.
In fact, I think we did our best today to provide a fairly balanced discussion. And if it didn't come across that way to you, I apologize. So we only have a couple minutes left, so we'll give both Dave and Brenna a chance to weigh in on this question of cost.
Well, I mean, I think, again, it goes back to, do you think a complex industrial process should be regulated or should it be banned? If you think it should be regulated, you regulate it the best you can and you make sure that you have processes in place to mitigate problems when they happen. That's the way we approach most things. There's not too many things that we ban outright unless they're, proven incredibly harmful. In this case, it's exactly the opposite. All the regulators, all the scientists who've looked at this, who are advising policymakers, certainly our states, and by the way, I haven't mentioned a Republican yet, except for Dick Cheney, and that was a negative connotation. So, this is not the industry against everyone else's point of view. This is, if we were having this discussion about climate change, she'd be the denier, because 80% of people, 90% of people lined up here, and then there's a few people say, oh, we have to ban it, even though it's something that's been going on, no one noticed, and nobody cared about. So,
hey, I think I made it very clear. I think I made it very clear.
And give me your email as well.
Yeah. Dave, can you give us a website that we might want to visit for more information?
Yes, sure. My off-the-top musings are at EID California, CALIF on Twitter, and then eidcalifornia.org is our website, and from there you can access the Energy in-depth campaigns from around the country, because we're active in all the different places where oil and gas takes place.
EID.org.
EIDcalifornia.org.
EIDcalifornia.org. Brenna, we only have a minute or so, but by all means, take the last word.
I think one thing that's really interesting to note that people don't talk about a lot is the economic problems this actually brings to communities and the real costs. Nationwide Insurance recently released a report showing that they wouldn't cover damages associated with fracking. Quicken Loans has denied loans to people living near fracking wells on their neighbor's property. People are seeing huge plummets in their property values, and they're not able to get loans or mortgages from major banks like Wells Fargo, and are unable to sell their home. And these are documented cases of what's really happening on a financial level to people. They think they're going to get rich and sell and get royalties, and then they end up with a home they can't sell. And so this is a very real economic problem to communities as well. And I think, one last thing I'll mention is a recent report that was released based on data from the South Coast Air Quality Management District. And it showed just in the last 3 months alone that oil companies have used 12 dangerous air toxic chemicals in the Los Angeles basin. One of these, for instance, is Christine Silica, used at least 117 times in the last 3 months. And it's known to cause skin, eyes, kidneys, lung, and immune system problems, and is a known carcinogen released into our air.
And Brenna, I'm sorry to interrupt, but a website where our audience can go for further information from your perspective?
And I'll actually give you my direct email, so if you want all the science and sources I noted today, I'm happy to provide all of that. My email is bnorton@fwwatch.org. Send you all of the science and documented facts, and our website is foodandwaterwatch.org.
Foodandwaterwatch.org. Mm-hmm. Well, if you guys think that this conversation was a bit heated, just wait till next week, because next week we're talking about K-12 public education reform, and we're going to be joined by Los Angeles Unified Superintendent John Daisy, as well as a representative from the United Teachers of Los Angeles Teachers Union. My guess is that conversation will be not even as civil and respectful as this one has been, and we hope you'll join us for that. Also, next Thursday evening at 5 p.m., we'll be having a conversation on political reform, engaging California citizens, reform and best practices. That's from 5 to 6:30 next Thursday, the 26th, in the Davidson Conference Center. But first, long before those take place, join me in thanking our panelists, Brenna Norton, Jake Jordan, Dave Quast, and Kelsey Harrison. Thank you very much. Join me in thanking our colleagues at the Schwarzenegger Institute for the work they do to make these programs come off each week. Thank you very much. Thanks to Daniel Rothberg and his team at the Daily Trojan for joining us and helping us through these conversations each week. And finally, thanks to Kirsten Olson, to Jody Epstein, to Andrena Hidalgo, to Lucas Servodio, and especially to Laura Hill and the team of student workers at the Unruh Institute for the work they do in making these programs happen each week. Guys, thanks very much. We'll look forward to seeing you next Wednesday.